Urban fantasy is deceptive. On the surface, it looks like a story about magic, but structurally, it's actually a hard-boiled detective novel wearing a wizard hat. If you miss the specific beats of a procedural mystery, the whole story falls apart. Hi guys, my name is Jason Hamilton. I'm a fantasy author, and I used to work for Kindlepreneur, where I spent years studying how books are written and sold. But really, I'm just the most obsessed storytelling nerd that I know. And to figure out how urban fantasy, this specific standard urban fantasy, actually works, I didn't just guess. I did a deep dive on actual bestsellers in this genre, books with over 1,000 reviews and a 4.5-star average or higher. I used a mixture of my own analysis and AI to pick them apart scene by scene, and what I found was shockingly consistent. In this case, I've formed it into a 23-chapter template that practically guarantees a page-turner. So let's break down that template. Starting with Act 1, which includes the setup and the squeeze. We have to start by looking at the foundation. You can't just drop a wizard into a city and hope for the best. You need constraint. You need pressure. Chapter 1 is distinct in urban fantasy because it functions as the double life. We aren't just seeing the protagonist existing, we are seeing them juggle. They are usually navigating a gritty, mundane environment. Think paying rent, fixing a car, or working a dead-end job, while managing a hidden, dangerous aspect of their identity. Maybe it's a concealed magical heritage, or maybe they are managing an addiction to a curse. This chapter needs to accomplish two things. First, it gives us a save the cat moment, where they handle a minor conflict that demonstrates they are hyper-competent, but desperately trying to stay under the radar. Second, it highlights their fear. The status quo is a house of cards. They are barely holding it together, and on the periphery, we see the first sign that this anonymity is about to end. Then we shatter that illusion in Chapter 2, the intrusion. That threat we glimpsed, it kicks down the front door, and this is your inciting incident. A magical creature rampages through a non-magical zone, or a corpse shows up with arcane runes carved into it. And this event strips away the protagonist's safety net. They lose their job, their apartment, or their disguise. Things get upended. Crucially, this is where you also introduce the rival or the love interest. In this genre, they are often the same person. This character represents the elite magical society that the protagonist hates, or is going to come to hate. They are powerful, arrogant, and create immediate friction. This sizzle is vital because it establishes the class difference between your street-level hero and the ivory tower magical establishment. Chapter 3 is the squeeze. The protagonist tries to do damage control. They want to go back to being a nobody, but the narrative won't let them. The mundane authorities or magical gatekeepers back them into a corner with an ultimatum. Go to magical prison, or accept a suicide mission from the arrogant elite faction that we just met. They try to refuse, but the stakes are personal. Maybe they have a little sister who is threatened, or need some money for a specific desperate reason. Whatever the case is, they have no choice. That leads us directly to Chapter 4, crossing the threshold, and they sign the deal. They step out of the mundane world and enter into the special world, like a hidden guild hall or a supernatural bureau. They are a fish out of water here, looked down upon by the snobs in robes. This is also where you usually introduce the sidekick or the mentor, someone who isn't trying to kill them or arrest them, giving the reader a little breathing room before the real work begins. That leads us to Act 2, Part 1, which is the investigation. So now we are in the thick of it. The hero is in the world, they have the mission, and they have a handler they can't stand. Chapter 5 is the uneasy alliance. The protagonist is forced to sit down with that rival or love interest to review the case. We need to see a transfer of respect here. Through a briefing or a sparring session, the elite rival realizes the street rat knows things that they don't. We call this the competence. The romantic or sexual tension spikes not because they are flirting, but because they are arguing about methods, and it sets up the enemies to partners dynamic that empowers the B story. In Chapter 6, the investigation actually starts. They hit the streets. They go to a seedy magical nightclub or a black market alchemy shop, places that the elite rival wouldn't be caught dead in. The protagonist uses their street smarts to get a clue, but here's the twist. The simple case of the murdered goblin or the stolen wand, whatever it is, isn't that simple. It connects to a darker, ancient conspiracy involving forbidden magic like necromancy or blood magic or something of that nature. So the scope just widened. Following that lead brings us to Chapter 7, the test. This is your first major action set piece, often called the first pinch point. The team walks into an ambush. A secondary monster or enforcer tries to wipe them out, and during the chaos, the protagonist is separated from their powerful handler. They have to survive alone. This scares them not just because they might die, but because they almost revealed their secret power to survive. They managed to hide it, but it was close. Chapter 8, the come down, provides a necessary breather. After the adrenaline of the ambush, the protagonist and the love interest share a quiet moment. Maybe they're just patching up wounds or sharing a drink in a safe house. And the barriers drop. We learn that the perfect, arrogant elite has their own scars. The protagonist starts to feel guilty for lying to someone who just was watching their back, and this deepens the bond and raises the emotional stakes. Chapter 9 is the red herring. Based on everything that they've found, the team identifies a suspect, like a rival gang leader or a shady warlock, and they plan a raid. The protagonist has to take a big risk, maybe breaking a law or using a sketchy artifact to make the bust happen. They execute the plan, the doors get kicked in, and they think they've won. But readers of this genre know better, because we haven't even hit the middle of the book yet. Chapter 10 is the midpoint disaster. The raid reveals that the suspect is innocent or just a pawn. The true villain is someone much scarier, but the real kick in the teeth is personal. While the protagonist was busy playing detective, the villain struck at their home. A dependent is kidnapped, or a mentor is attacked, or their sanctuary is burned to the ground. The stakes shift instantly from "I'm doing this job to stay out of jail" to "I am going to kill whoever did this." The protagonist stops being reactive and becomes active. They are no longer a victim of circumstances, they are now a hunter. By the way, if you'd like to learn more about how to use a plot template like this one, combined with AI as an author-led productivity tool to help you write 12 plus books a year easily, maybe more, and without compromising your creativity or ethics, I would invite you to check out the Story Hacker Gold group, linked down in the description. All right, so let's go to Act 2, Part 2. After the disaster, we have to pick up the pieces. So Chapter 11 is assessing the damage. The protagonist is reeling from guilt. The magical authorities usually try to pull them off the case, claiming they are too emotional. And this is a key beat. The love interest intervenes. They defy their own bosses to stick with the protagonist, and this cements the alliance. They go rogue, setting up a secret location to finish this off the books. Chapter 12 is where we get the exposition dump that doesn't feel like a dump. They look at ancient texts or visit an oracle or figure out what the villain is really doing. They discover some kind of MacGuffin that is linked to the protagonist's specific legacy or bloodline, and this isn't a coincidence. They were drawn into this because they are the only ones who can stop it, and destiny has entered the chat. Now we need a tonal shift. Chapter 13 is the heist prep. To stop the villain, they need to get into some high-security location, a gala or a vampire ball or a secure vault. And we get the fun of planning, logistics, and the comedic friction of the rough protagonist having to learn etiquette or wear a tuxedo. It's the sort of calm before the storm. The love interest helps them armor up, and we get a moment charged with admiration and desire. Chapter 14 is the masquerade. The infiltration happens. They aim to blend in. The tension comes from maintaining the cover while hunting for the objective. And we usually get a pink romantic moment here, like a dance or a stolen whisper in a corner, before reality crashes back in. They spot the villain, but it feels wrong. It's too easy. Now, Chapter 15 is the trap springs. The villain knew they were coming. Chaos flows, the protagonist is cornered, and the villain offers a choice. Join them and surrender the power, or watch the team die. The protagonist refuses naturally, but the villain unleashes some kind of devastating attack. This is your second pinch point. It shows just how outclassed our heroes are. Chapter 16 is the retreat. They barely get out alive. They lose the MacGuffin, or the rescue fails. They are battered, bleeding, and morale is at a zero. The protagonist blames himself. And to make matters worse, the love interest usually takes a hit meant for the hero. They retreat to a place of last resort, effectively admitting defeat, and this is the all is lost moment. Chapter 17 is the Dark Night. Isolated, the protagonist confronts their internal demons. They think about running away, but a conversation, maybe with the sidekick or the injured love interest, recontextualizes the struggle. They realize that the curse or monster side of them that they've been hiding is actually a weapon. They decide to stop suppressing it, and they accept their identity. And that leads us directly into Act 3. This final act is a sprint. Chapter 18 is the rally. The protagonist gathers what's left of the team. They come up with a desperate, high-risk plan that relies entirely on the protagonist's unique, formerly hidden abilities, and this is where the found family aspect shines. Everyone steps up. The protagonist arms themselves, symbolizing that they are no longer hiding. Chapter 19 is storming the stronghold. The final battle kicks off. The side characters peel off to handle minions or disable wards, channeling the action so the protagonist is funneled toward the boss. The pacing here should be frantic and brutal. Chapter 20, The Confrontation, pits the hero against the villain. The villain is on the verge of victory, completing the ritual. The hero uses some kind of conventional attacks, like guns or standard spells, but it does nothing. They are pushed to the brink of death, and it looks impossible. Then we get Chapter 21, The Unleashing. This is why readers buy these books. With no other options, the protagonist voluntarily breaks the seal. They unleash their legacy or forbidden magic in some kind of spectacular, terrifying display. It's the Super Saiyan moment. This power overwhelms the villain and destroys the threat, but it leaves the protagonist drained and exposed. And the secret is out. Everyone sees what they really are. Chapter 22 is when the dust settles. In the immediate aftermath, the authorities arrive. The protagonist expects to be arrested for using some kind of forbidden magic, but the partner or a high-ranking mentor intervenes. They get a pardon or a cover-up based on their heroism, and victims are reunited. The adrenaline crashes into exhaustion. Finally, Chapter 23, The New Reality. We fast forward a few days, and the protagonist has healed, but the status quo from Chapter 1 is gone forever. They can't go back to the shadows. They accept a permanent role in the magical world or set up shop as a private investigator. The relationship with the love interest is solidified into a partner dynamic, and the protagonist looks out at the city ready for the next monster. Now, you might be thinking that's a great structure for book 1, but what about book 2 or book 10? Because long series are very common in urban fantasy. The common writing advice is that it depends. I, of course, hate that answer. And while sequels have variables, the DNA of a bestseller remains more or less consistent. You can't just copy and paste the template, though, because the first book is an origin story. The hero has already crossed the threshold. So here's what changes for the sequels. First, the double life chapter transforms into the new world. You don't need to prove they are mundane anymore. You show them running their agency or working for the Bureau, and the refusal of the call disappears or becomes very weak. In a sequel, the hero is more proactive. They are a problem solver, and we don't need 3 chapters of them debating if magic is real. Second, the stakes must escalate. In book 1, the threat is more local, maybe a killer in the city. But by book 2, it's political or regional, and by book 4, it's existential, the end of the world, that kind of thing. You cannot repeat the same small-scale murder mystery 10 times without weaving in a larger threat. But here's what stays the same, and this is where most authors mess up. You must keep the case of the month. Urban fantasy is a procedural. Even if there's a looming war with the Fae, every book needs a kind of specific contained plot that is resolved by the end. You need an inciting incident, an investigation, and a villain that gets taken down. If you write a book that is just characters talking about their feelings without a mystery, your sales will tank. You also keep the midpoint disaster. You keep the friction with authority, and you absolutely keep the power level reveal in the climax. It becomes about mastery rather than discovery. Readers crave that moment when the hero does something with their magic that leaves everyone staring in shock. So don't remove that. This template is not a cage. It's a set of building blocks. Use the pinch points, use the midway shift, and respect the genre expectations. If you do that, you won't just write a good book, you'll write a series that people obsess over. If you are serious about writing in the genre, I actually have a massive resource for you. I've published a book that goes into much more depth on the genre of standard urban fantasy. You can buy that book, but you can also get it at no extra charge along with many of my other book genre analyses by joining the Story Hacker Gold group. We walk through the entire process from idea to published book, utilizing the best tools available. So give that a look, and I'll see you in the next video.